a great follow-on from what you were just hearing, and I will get on to talking about continuous product management, picking up on a bunch of Ken's themes in a minute. But first, I want to talk about interviewing for senior product manager roles, and I want to tell you about my favorite PM interview question, and that's this. Tell me about something you built that you really shouldn't have. Now, I kind of like disaster stories, more on that later. But first of all, can I just see how many people either use this question or have experienced this question in interviewing? Yeah. So you probably know, like, one thing that's really great about this question is that there is a definite wrong answer to this one. And I'll show you that wrong answer. It is. Is it up? There we go. I have never made a bad decision because I am such a great PM. And I actually used to get this about, sort of 5 years ago. I got a lot of these through. And what I hear when somebody tells me that is I have never had real responsibility, or I never stuck around long enough to see what goes wrong when I made lousy decisions. Either way, it's like, bye-bye, next please. But the thing I was hoping to hear was something more along the lines of this. I had responsibility, I was wrong, and I learned. I accepted an acquisition that my superiors handed me, and I slammed it into a product, and users super hated it, and I learned not to do that and to be user-centric on workflows. Something like that, which tells me a learning story. It tells me that you've got some humility, that you're actively learning, and also that you got some experience. Like, I don't want you making all your mistakes in my job. I want you to have some failures coming into it so you do not make them when you are working on my team. But here's the thing. The world of product is changing, and a new class of good answers has emerged to this tell me about something you built that you shouldn't have. And that's, I didn't build the thing. I made a lot of mistakes, I swear, all these bad decisions along the way, but we corrected in user testing and we took some tough decisions and killed it. And so I'm getting some really great candidates through who haven't actually had a massive product failure, but instead who have taken these techniques, a lot of the things like Ken was talking about trying to, empower product teams and try and have continuous learning and all of those things that actually save them from the huge failures. And this is a whole family of techniques I want to talk about today. I'm going to draw a big bucket around this whole family of great techniques and call them the continuous product management in order to distinguish them from the context that these good things often sit in, which is that rigid upfront planning, that top-down command and control, that version of management which suggests that things are knowable, like we want certainty, which is the opposite of that. And so we're watching this play out now where we have these really healthy product practices happening in these small groups in these huge contexts of this massive clash of worlds, especially in larger organizations. So I am personally living this clash of contexts. Mike mentioned that I work for an organization called 18F. He did not mention that 18F is a branch of the federal government within the General Services Administration. And so I am watching this play out on the large scale and trying to play my part in encouraging good practices for products and services that get delivered. And many of you who read the newspapers know that government is a great source of massive failures. So for somebody who's actually quite a student of these things, this is these huge, especially in IT projects, these enormous failures that come along. So here's a case, I don't know if you can read it from the back, but it's a case of spending $300 million on a Medicaid eligibility system that never shipped. Never launched anything. And then they throw another $100 million at the same people. And I mean, so it's this kind of context that we're operating in. And we, as 18F, this organization within the General Services Administration, are trying to coach in these healthy, continuous product practices, but in this landscape of enormous top-down control and huge bureaucracy. So we are in a world where only 13%, and some people think this is an overestimate, only 13% of government software projects over $6 million are successful. The other 87% are a gigantic car crash. In many cases, you get more lawsuits generated from these projects than lines of code actually shipped to users. I'm not actually joking. They're these big failures, these $100 million debacles that we're reading about in the newspapers. And so what we're really trying to do here, just to downplay our role a little bit, We're the driving instructors for government product managers. And often these people are managing digital services. They don't even think of themselves as product managers. But we're trying to get them to steer a little more safely. We're trying to get them not to do this, and a little bit more like nice and safe, good progress, no $100 million failures, and all that kind of thing. And I don't know how many of you can think back to kind of the good things that your driving instructors taught you when you were learning to drive. Can anyone shout out something driving instructors tell people to do? 10 and 2, yes, sort of healthy positioning, like make sure that you've got yourself set up so that you've got a good structure for executing your driving in. Definitely. Any others? Check your blind spots. That's another one, that kind of thing where we're trying to encourage people to scan 360, look around them for that whole situation that they're trying to land their service into. Any others? Turn off the high beams when it's snowing. All right. That one's a tough one to come up with an analogy for. But another one that I remember learning was be smooth. Smooth acceleration, smooth deceleration. Look far enough ahead that you can actually plan ahead and make, nice smooth turns. And all of that was about trying to take things in this really, sort of planned, measured, calm, smooth kind of way. And so that's something that we're trying to encourage. We're trying to encourage that smooth aspect to their product management. Again, that's small, slow, smooth to start with to avoid those giant failures and actually deliver the services that people need. And just to zoom out, we were talking product failures, it's all good fun. But I mean, you might have spotted, it was Medicaid up there, right? These are things which matter. These are places where it's not fail fast. These are places where failure counts. It affects lives. And so these are the places where it's not really okay to fail. We'd rather take that slow and smooth, get our successes and build them up, because we cannot keep failing the people these services are delivering to. So we try to coach people into that smooth aspect, into taking things nice and slowly, to steering their products well, 10 and 2 on the wheel. We also coach people to solve big problems, but in small pieces. And obviously, it's not just because it's harder to squander $300 million in $100,000 chunks. It's not just because of that, because we probably could do that if we tried. But instead, the point of taking it into small pieces is, as we all know, you do something small and you see how it went. You do something small and you see how it went. And we can actually get a rhythm going like that, where people are watching the effects of what they're developing and learning as they go. So especially for people with no background in product, it gives them a chance to build up some experience and build up that learning as they go. Now, you may not have any intuition about this. I think you've got intuition from driving about the value of smooth and the value of scanning and looking ahead and all of those things. But one thing you may not have intuition about is the impact of slow feedback, because there's not really a direct driving analogy. So I have scoured the internet to find you an intuition building video on this one. These chaps have modified a car so that the windscreen for the driver is delayed by 2 seconds, and they're trying to drive an obstacle course. So what do you think the impact of slow feedback is going to be? Shall we find out?
On your marks, get set, go!
Well, the monitor just fell off a little, so... I don't like this! I don't like this at all! I know! Stop! Really?
I think if you get hard right it, you might be able to do this.
That's so confusing! Wow!
Look into the future, open your third eye. Listen, you're gonna stop. You already know.
This is horrible! I thought I'd be able to treat this as a logic puzzle and my brain would be smart enough to do this.
You can't
so
see
wrong!
So wrong. And I love this because I don't think we always think about the impact that laggy feedback gives us. We kind of know the value of feedback, but in fact, there's plenty of evidence from plenty of mathematical modeling from control theory, which shows that lagged feedback makes you oversteer. And so you're much more prone to these wild swings of strategy or budget or whatever if you don't have sort of really constant good feedback coming in. So the questions that I want to talk about in the remaining time for this talk are, first, how do you steer your product smoothly? How do you avoid the chance of huge failure, and how do you try to minimize the disruption to teams as you're looking ahead and steering your product through all the challenges? And number two, how can I encourage senior leadership to adopt this continuous mindset? So in this clash of worlds, how can I push this upwards and work in a context so that I have a better chance of succeeding? And I'd like to call your attention, some of you are probably familiar with this, but some won't be, to continuous delivery as a model for this. So sometimes product managers kind of tune this out a little bit because it's been more from the development world, it's a little bit techy. But this is a set of practices which at their core are not terribly techy to enable fast feedback. And the principles, and this is articulated on the website continuousdelivery.com by Jez Humble, the principles are you build quality in, you work in small batches, everyone has collective responsibility for solving the problems you're trying to solve. And a lot of this may be familiar. If you're students of Lean, this will also come up. You'll recognize these things. They've taken this in the technical world and done a wonderful job of closing down feedback loops. So right now you can model the development feedback loop, something like this. A developer sits at the workstation and programs some software and sees immediate feedback by building and maybe some code coverage testing tool, some things right there in his environment. Expanding a little further, that development pushes code to some integration environment for the product, and then get some more tests. Often there's some security scanning that goes into that, some performance validation, some other things that are going into that next phase, and actually getting some quick feedback on whether this change technically is going to be successful when it goes out the door. And then finally, that goes out to the product, and you get validation of those actual, the thing the capability was trying to do. And what the continuous delivery techniques have done is they've shrunk that developer part of it. So they've managed to tighten up those feedback loops using a combination of technology and working practices. So that part is now short, it's faster to get through, and it's much more reliable, the software that people are producing now than, say, 10, 20 years ago, which is fantastic. But product isn't always taking advantage of the benefits that the development teams have given us this opportunity to get faster feedback, to get things out the door more quickly, to integrate that feedback more quickly. Product is not always embracing this, and I want to talk a little bit about the things we do which actually reinforce that command and control mindset, the budgeting, the distance, the slow feedback mentality, and call them out and name them, and then talk about that opposite, which is the continuous approaches. So what can I change as a product manager? Well, there are two parts, obviously, to this. There's process and culture, and here's where I'm going to be touching back on some of the same themes you just heard from Ken. I love it. So let's talk about the practices first. I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour through a lot of the things that we do, and then what it means to take a continuous mindset into them. So starting off with user research. So this is referencing a blog post that Marty Kagan did 2012. It's not exactly new news, but this is about continuous discovery. And he talks about engaging a whole team in that user research, and it talks about doing that continuously so that you're always discovering customer problems. You're always in conversation about validating your potential solutions. This is something much more constant than a phase of delivery. It's an ongoing conversation. And you find that teams that operate in this way tend to dump personas, for example, because they've got an actual user. Who needs a proxy user at that point? So there's a different way of operating. And this is a great foundational piece for actually building up a shared understanding around those user needs. And so it makes it much easier to steer later on because you've got those, as Ken was saying, a shared language between executives and teams. The team is actually much more in tune with the source of where those product ideas have come from. So user research changes in a continuous world. And here's a team that I worked with at one point who actually, they stuck this on the board about stuff we don't know. Here's what we're learning. Here are our conclusions. So they had actually an open and shared visibility into the results of their user research. The next subject is feature definition. And this is one that some of you know. I've got a thing about features. I think they're kind of toxic, but that's another subject, that's another talk. But what we find, though, with features is that articulating a feature list can keep people very attached to that list and make it really hard then to reprioritize and sort of move things around. So one person who's been writing a lot about this right now is John Cutler. He is trying to reframe from the feature factory, which is that just crank out stuff, but never really embrace the feedback and understand how it's affecting your user's market or user's world. And turning that into, what is a sequence of bets we can place? How can we actually, we've got our theory, our objectives, our outcomes we're trying to reach. What are the different things that we can do in product in its widest definition to try to engender that outcome? And so it's a sequence of bets. It's trying to say, well, we take the more promising things and dial those up, and we take the less promising things and dial those down. So Jim Collins talked about this in Good to Great. Again, these aren't brand new ideas, but this idea of continuous, like smoothly increasing investment on the things which are actually looking promising. I prefer the non-ballistic version, which is feed success and starve failure. You try out a bunch of things, you have your portfolio of bets, and then you amp up the ones that are working, you decrease the ones that aren't. But of course, if you don't have your feature list and you don't have all your work broken out into feature, 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 how do you do your prioritization? That becomes a problem too, because you are actually prioritizing maybe the investigation research on one potential bet with the development and shipping of another potential bet. And so you actually have an issue then with prioritizing where you don't have like for like. And so prioritizing has to be on the work in the framework of the bets and outcomes you're trying to engender. Roadmaps, once you don't have feature, 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 you also don't have the ability to communicate that to customers as roadmaps, which is just as well, because honestly, we kind of maybe overpromise a little in those and are committing ourselves to things. And this is actually one of the places where I see sort of the worst offender for anchoring us and making us unable to embrace the feedback that we're getting as we're actually delivering capabilities, is we have this roadmap that then we're kind of locked into. And so Bruce McCarthy, you're also seeing Jenna Bastow, a bunch of people writing about other techniques for writing up roadmaps which express the intent of the product, what you're trying to achieve, something about your strategy and approach, and then invite participation from the users on those points which are coming up next, or participating in the research, participating in placing those bets. And finally, measuring results. So in that command and control world, you'll see teams like handed their KPIs and thou shalt execute upon this. But in this continuous world, the results, their interpretation, collecting them, that's a conversation. It's an ongoing discussion about getting that information in, what it means, and what we should do about it. So that whole thing, there's a lot that changes when you're trying to build that continuous mindset, which actually bakes into forming up empowered teams. Which is why we need to talk about culture. And I was so happy that Ken brought this up, because I don't think we talk about this enough in product. In product, I'll just say. I think in general, we underestimate our impact on culture. I think that we consider ourselves to be consumers of it, that we are embedded in the culture of an organization and forget how much of an impact we have on setting it. So just the way we interact with teams, do we choose to talk with the whole team and share context? Do we invite them into our decision making? How do we actually, do we talk to sort of one person for UX and a different person for development and not actually integrate perspectives? What are we doing in that aspect of the culture? The things we do can have a big impact. Back at a company I used to work for called Redgate, this used to be my profile picture. For those of you in the back who can't see it, it's me holding a sign that says ship it, looking a bit like this. And at the time this was taken, it was in a whole tapestry of funny pictures people had, and the development teams were really bad at getting capabilities out the door. They would develop stuff up to the point of integration, then be like, done! And so I, as a product person, was forever saying, ship it, ship it, ship it, come on, we need to get into users, it's not done until somebody's seen it, come on, ship it! And so this was the picture. And then over time, this meme developed, and I started to hear more and more, they just want us to ship bad stuff. And I heard this, I actually got this in a meeting with me. Somebody said, they just want us to ship excrement. And I was, they do? Who's this they? And can I talk to them? And the person sort of shuffled and was like, and I realized they was me. And they were getting an impression about me, what I wanted them, the behavior I wanted to engender. And I thought, well, where could they have gotten this from? Like, honestly, I tell them all the time. I tell them, bake quality in. I tell them, validate. Like, what? Where could they possibly get this? Oh. And I kind of dawned on me, the only place I could imagine it came from was this picture, this shouting picture about ship it. And I changed it. So I wrote a blog post for the company, explicitly changed it to another picture, which it's cheesy, but it did the job of reframing the discussion from ship, 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 ship to, no, honest. What I really want you to do is this, think about those feedback loops, yes, please. And so it's a little thing, but it matters. Like if we talk about shipping and we talk about, getting stuff out there and all that, people are going to respond to that and they are going to focus on the deliverables and on the outputs. So you gotta watch how you talk the talk when you're doing this product work with teams. The other thing you probably would note about this picture is that it is a bit confrontational. It is not a picture that you would associate with the phrase psychological safety. And so referring again back to what Ken was just saying, this is one of those things that especially as you're asking teams to squeeze those feedback loops, you've got to be sharing business context with those teams. And you're often working at the objective level rather than at the feature level. And so the people are embracing a lot of uncertainty as they're making this transition. And it's absolutely essential that they have a sense of psychological safety as they're doing this. It's a hard transition anyway to learn new skills and to develop these new capabilities, but especially when you're asking them to take on risk and you're asking them to really put themselves out there, to learn, to trust, to be vulnerable. The psychological safety is so, so important. And so having, a strident, confrontational, even a picture is absolutely the wrong message for a product person to team. So those key things that product people need to engender to enable some kind of continuous product management is, first of all, that outcome focus. Make sure that we're all rallied around the same thing we're trying to achieve. We need a sense of shared responsibility on that team. It does not work in terms of squeezing those feedback loops down. It does not work to separate out user experience research from development, from test, from release. It doesn't make sense anymore. Those things actually have to be combined with a shared responsibility around those outcomes that we're trying to achieve. The other thing, people bandy this word about empowerment a lot, but it needs to be understood, I think, in our community as being supplying teams with the context they need, the skills they need, and then giving them space to actually do those new things that you're asking them to do. So I mean it not in the kind of hand-wave empowerment, but in the sense of we've got to make sure those teams have the skills and support that they need to be operating in this new continuous way. And the last thing I want to call out, here I put in the positive, effectiveness, but I also want to talk about the negative, which we sometimes use as productivity. And this is one of those things that if there's anything that I think pulls people back into that mindset of got to get stuff out there, got to ship, and that output focus, us talking about productivity does that, whereas talking about team effectiveness and engagement gives folks a chance to operate better. And then we're not trying to just get things out there, we're trying to make sure that they're effective for the challenge, whatever that outcome is. Great, okay. We understand now how to support teams, perfect, but how can we encourage the senior leadership to adopt this kind of continuous mindset as well? Because it's all very well for the things where we've got some agency, some control, some authority, it's all nice and easy in that case. But when you're taking senior leadership, obviously we don't have that anymore, but the continuous delivery principles still apply. Those lean principles have actually been taken into a whole management system by a guy called Bjart Bogsnes, and he has started something called Beyond Budgeting and sort of crystallized a management system around these principles, but at the whole company level. And it's not just toy problems. The whole company that he was doing this for initially is Statoil, which is a $60 billion company, taking these principles of empowerment to the whole company level. However, it is hard. So this academic paper calling it a high-hanging fruit. It's serious, though. It's really hard to get there from wherever you're starting in an organization, but it's still a direction that we can go. So in this case, budgeting is not used just in the narrow sense. He's talking about beyond budgeting because budgeting interacts with accountability, which interacts with transparency, which interacts with your planning and targets, and all of those things are interrelated. You can't just fix one of them. You have to actually put it, to work towards a whole new system. So I encourage you to take a look at this. I'm not going to go into this in any kind of detail, but the Beyond Budgeting 12 principles, of which the 10th one is continuous resource allocation. So make resources available as they're needed to break out of these budget cycles, which lend us to biting off too much in products, which lend us to slow feedback, which lend us to failures. So this is something, there is a system out there to work towards. Like there is hope. There is this can work for some people, but how do we do it? And I want to talk a little bit about how senior management sees us. So when I was working for one CEO, he tried for a long time to make changes to the website, super hated the company website, really couldn't stand it. And so he was trying all the time to kind of update it in ways that he liked. And we, of course, as the next tier down, not so much me as a product person, I was letting marketing kind of worry about this, but they were kind of acting in that shit umbrella kind of way, right? We use phrases like the hippos coming in and prioritizing. We use all these phrases, swoop and poop for managers coming in. I've not had that one, it's a great one. And so we have all of this language around that about trying to protect people from these terrible ideas that are coming from senior management. Well, they see us as the frozen middle. We are permafrost. And I say this with authority because I went and started looking this up. Like, this is all over. You can find this in Inc. magazine, Fortune. You can find this in the Harvard Business Review. These references to this layer of management which doesn't want to change, which rejects their attempts to steer us in new directions. So bear in mind how they're seeing us, that for all we're pushing back on the things that we think, oh, they don't really know, they are not being invited into those discussions either. And sometimes you get these kind of tantrum restructures, which is what happened in this case, where the CEO who couldn't fix his website restructured the entire company with layoffs and kept coming back to the fact that we are not an effective company if we cannot fix one website. But it's a lesson learned about how we actually interact up and down the chain to make sure that people can feel effective with their input. So there's a phrase which is attributed to Stephen Covey, although there's no actually evidence that he said this specific phrase, that change travels at the speed of trust. And I love this phrase because it really captures the thing that we're trying to achieve in building those relationships between the layers. When we're trying to share our context, we're trying to work towards these methods. In fact, what we're really doing here is trying to understand each other and build layers of trust in between the different levels. And so as an example, if we're trying to develop empathy with our senior management, we can consider designing our interactions with them in ways that respect their concerns and their own, dare we say, user stories. So as a leader, I need to know the critical information so I don't get caught off guard. There's one thing they absolutely hate is finding out from one of their peers something bad has happened and you didn't tell them and actually prepare them for that. So we can prepare them. We can, give them risk assessments of things that are constructive. We can work with them on planning it. We can actually make sure that they know those things that they might get caned over. As a leader, I need to know options so I can guide decisions based on context only I have. And that's something that, especially in those mottos of the hippo coming in to prioritize, I think we often forget that they've got some information that we cannot possibly have. They will have information about lawsuits that are going on, about company financials that we won't have. They might know, a CEO might know that he plans to sell the company in a year, and valuation is all that matters. Like, they'll have information that we won't necessarily have in the other parts of the company. So offering options is critical. Here is what happens if you move in this direction. I think if you invested more in this and less in that, this is what would happen. But here are a set of options and what I believe they would mean to you. So I bring up all these things as a way of trying to, again, build that empathy with senior management so that we can let change flow up and down continuously in these organizations. And it's certainly, these are approaches that we're trying to use all the time in our work, trying to coach our product teams towards continuous operation, but then trying to coach them in their interactions with those difficult contexts they're working in. So when you're in a position to change things, I put all this work in to do this talk just to get to this point right here, that when you're in a position to change things, I would really like to encourage you towards that team empowerment mindset, to give you some references as a jumping off point so that you can, the slides will be yours, use them, build on them, please. When you're in a position, think about moving towards that empowered team and that continuous mindset. And helped by, some coaching on interview questions that we have done early in this conversation, I fully expect you to be in those senior product roles and working with those leaders towards towards new systems of continuous management of businesses. And then when you are those executive leaders, remember you have options. It doesn't have to be the traditional budgeting, and that is not the only way of operating. There are very large companies who are operating on different principles now. It can be done, and you can operate in a continuous way, even in those contexts, those large business contexts. So when you're in that position, please remember that you have options. So thank you very much, and safe travels in your continuous product management journey.